Ember stared at the empty bank account on her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through the last few transactions. The numbers were all wrong. They didn't match up with the plans she and Ethan had made just a few weeks ago. Ethan, her husband of 5 years, had promised they were building something solid together. Dreams of a home they could retire in, savings for their future, and even plans for a small business he had convinced her would be their next big step. But now, as Ember stared at the bank statement, it was all gone. Every penny they'd saved, every dream they had evaporated. The money, all of it, had been drained from their accounts without a trace. And Ethan? He was gone. Vanished without a word, leaving nothing but a cold emptiness where trust once stood. At first, Ember thought it was a mistake. Maybe there had been an error. Maybe she was looking at the wrong account. But as the hours passed and she pieced together more clues, it became painfully clear. Ethan had taken everything. His phone was switched off, his car was gone, and he hadn't even left a note. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Ember's heart raced, her mind trying to comprehend what had just happened. The man she loved, the man she thought she could trust, had not only stolen from her but had planned it with the precision of someone who'd done it before. He hadn't just taken their savings. He'd taken the life they had built together, the future she thought they shared. Her hands clenched into fists as the first wave of anger hit her. How could he do this? How could he betray her like this? She was left with nothing, her whole world turned upside down. A hollow feeling settling deep in her chest. Ember had always been the kind of person who worked hard, who believed in building a life slowly, one step at a time, and Ethan had been a part of that. He'd seemed just as invested, just as committed. But now, with all his lies and secrets revealed, Ember understood that everything had been a lie. He'd used her trust to rob her blind. But Ember wasn't one to stay down for long. She wasn't going to let this be the end of her story. She knew she had to find him. There was no way she was going to sit back and let him get away with this. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. She had to think clearly. The first step was simple. She would track him down. She had always been good at noticing details, paying attention to the small things that other people missed. Ethan had underestimated her. The money wasn't the only thing he'd taken from her. He had taken her trust, and now she was going to make him regret it. Ember spent the next few days digging into every part of Ethan's life she could. She went through their emails, his phone records, and every little scrap of information he'd left behind. She called his old friends, his business contacts, and even a few people from his past who had dropped off the radar. What she found was more than she could have expected. Ethan had been planning this for months. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. No, he had carefully and methodically drained their savings, sold off assets, and set up new accounts under fake names. He had been building an entire new life without her, all while pretending everything was fine at home. The man she had shared her life with had been living a double life, and the truth hurt deeper than any betrayal could. But even with all the pieces falling into place, Ember felt the frustration building. She had everything now, the evidence, the facts, the details. But Ethan was still out there, somewhere, slipping through her fingers like sand. He thought he could run away, leave her with nothing, and move on with his life. But Ember wasn't going to let him. The rage inside her simmered quietly, a fire burning low and steady, but determined. He would not get away with this. He would pay for what he had done, not just financially, but emotionally. She had been nothing but loyal to him, and now she was going to make sure he paid for breaking her trust. Days turned into weeks, and Ember's investigation only deepened. She started to notice patterns. Ethan had been careful, but not perfect. There were trails he had left behind, small mistakes that revealed his next move. She learned where he had been spending time, who he had been talking to, and even some of the places he might have hidden away his stolen money. As the walls closed in, Ember felt a sense of power return to her. She wasn't helpless anymore. She had the upper hand, and it was only a matter of time before she confronted him. She wasn't the naive woman she had been when she first met him. Ember had changed. She had learned, adapted, and become someone who wouldn't let herself be walked on. Then one day a breakthrough came. Ember found him. He was living under a new name in a small rented apartment in a different town, trying to start over with the money he'd taken. It wasn't the grand escape he had envisioned. He hadn't built a new life at all. He had just run away to hide, leaving behind a trail of destruction and lies. When Ember showed up at his doorstep, she wasn't angry. She wasn't crying either. She was calm, her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. Ethan opened the door, surprise and guilt flooding his face when he saw her standing there. He tried to talk his way out of it, tried to manipulate her again, but Ember wasn't listening. She had already heard enough lies. "Did you really think you could just take everything from me and walk away?" Ember asked, her voice low, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "You were always so sure of yourself, always so confident you'd get away with it, but you didn't count on me. You didn't count on the fact that I'm not as weak as you thought." Ethan stammered, his face falling as he realized she wasn't buying any of his excuses anymore. Ember stepped forward, showing him the evidence she had gathered, every small detail that proved his betrayal. She watched as his confidence crumbled, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long time, Ember smiled, not out of malice, but out of the satisfaction that she had won. Ethan might have thought he could run away, but he had underestimated the strength and determination of the woman he had left behind. With that, Ember left him standing there, his world falling apart as she walked away. She didn't need his money anymore. She didn't need his lies. What she had found, what she had regained, was something far more valuable: her self-respect, her independence, and the knowledge that she could stand on her own 2 feet, no matter what. Ethan had taken the money, but Ember had taken her power back, and that, in the end, was worth far more than anything he could ever steal. In the days that followed, Ember felt a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in months. The weight of the unknown, the crushing feeling of betrayal, had finally lifted. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Ethan's disappearance had forced her to confront a version of herself she hadn't known existed. Someone capable of standing up for herself. Someone who could face the truth no matter how painful. As the dust settled, Ember realized that while Ethan had taken the money, he had left something far more valuable behind: her. Ember spent the following week in a quiet haze of relief and reflection. She didn't rush to tell anyone what had happened. Instead, she focused on herself. She made calls to her bank to reverse the damage and reclaim what she could. And she met with a financial advisor to start rebuilding from the ground up. Slowly but surely, Ember started to see the path ahead. It wasn't the future she had envisioned with Ethan, but it was one that she could create on her own, and that felt empowering in a way she hadn't expected. It was during this time of quiet restoration that Ember received a phone call she hadn't anticipated. A number she didn't recognize flashed on her screen, and when she answered, the voice on the other end made her freeze. It was Ethan. His tone was low, almost pleading, as he explained that he had messed up. He said he was sorry, that he didn't mean for things to go the way they did. But Ember wasn't listening to his words anymore. She had already heard enough of his lies to last a lifetime. "Ethan," she interrupted, her voice steady and clear. "I've heard all the excuses before. I'm done listening." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Ember wondered if he had even expected this reaction. He had always underestimated her, always thought she was too soft to fight back. But the truth was, Ember was stronger than she had ever been. "I don't need your apologies," she continued. "What I need is for you to stay out of my life and let me move on. You took everything from me, Ethan, but you didn't take my future, and that's what matters now." Ethan tried to argue, but Ember hung up before he could say another word. She didn't need closure from him. She didn't need anything from him anymore. The decision to sever ties had been made long ago, and the phone call only confirmed it. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, was nothing more than a shadow of the person she had once loved. Ember was done with him. As the days went by, Ember focused more on her future. She started to rebuild, piece by piece, and the more she did, the more she realized just how much she had left behind. The garden she had once planted with Ethan, the plans for a life together, all of it was gone. But Ember didn't dwell on the past. Instead, she took small steps each day, working on projects she had always wanted to do but had put off for Ethan's sake. She painted the old guest room, converted it into a cozy reading nook, and even started a new hobby, gardening. There was something therapeutic about planting seeds, watching them grow into something beautiful, and knowing she was the one nurturing them. It felt like taking control, like creating something new from the ashes of her old life. But as Ember's life slowly started to return to normal, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan hadn't entirely given up. Despite his promises to stay out of her life, there was still something about him that lingered, something unsettling. And then, just when she thought she had seen the last of him, she received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from him directly, but from his lawyer. The contents of the letter made her blood run cold. Ethan was attempting to claim a portion of their shared assets, arguing that since they were still technically married, he had rights to part of what Ember had worked so hard to rebuild. The audacity, the nerve. Ember's hands clenched into fists as she read the letter, her mind racing. She wasn't going to let him do this. Not after everything he had already taken. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the principle of it. Ethan thought he could ruin her, but he didn't know the strength he had underestimated. Ember wasn't going to back down. She would fight for what was hers, and this time, she wasn't alone. She reached out to a lawyer and began the process of securing her future once and for all. The lawyer explained that since the assets had already been separated and she had ample documentation proving Ethan's betrayal, there was little chance of him succeeding in his claim. Still, Ember wasn't going to take any chances. She would make sure that everything was in her name, completely out of his reach. She had already given him too much of her life, and now she would take back control. In the weeks that followed, the legal battle played out, but it was clear from the beginning that Ember was going to win. Ethan's lawyer couldn't present any solid evidence to counter Ember's claims, and slowly but surely, his attempt to reclaim what he had lost fizzled out. When the final ruling came through, Ember breathed a sigh of relief. She had won. Not just in court, but in life. As she stood on the balcony of her new apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ember realized just how far she had come. She had taken everything that Ethan had stolen from her and turned it into something better. The garden she had planted was blooming. The life she had once shared with a man who didn't deserve her was now a distant memory, replaced by something far stronger, her own resilience. And when the last laugh came, when she finally walked away from the courtroom, victorious, Ember smiled. Not because she had beaten Ethan, but because she had won the greatest prize of all, her freedom. Months passed, and life for Ember began to take on a new rhythm. Each morning, she woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was capable of. Her days were no longer filled with the weight of betrayal or the uncertainty of her future. Instead, she filled them with projects that mattered to her, things she had put on hold for years. She dedicated herself to her career, something she had always been passionate about, but had neglected while trying to build a life with Ethan. She expanded her circle, reconnecting with friends who had faded into the background as Ethan's influence had grown. Ember discovered the joy of independence again, and it felt like a rebirth. Every step she took forward was a reminder of how far she had come, but despite the peace she had found, a part of Ember couldn't shake the unease that lingered. It was the feeling that Ethan might still be out there, scheming, trying to find a way back into her life. His absence had been sudden, almost too clean. There were still questions that hung in the air. How had he managed to disappear so completely? Why hadn't he tried harder to contact her? Did he have something else planned? One rainy evening, Ember's phone buzzed, and when she looked at the screen, her stomach dropped. The message was from an unfamiliar number. She opened it cautiously, her heartbeat picking up as she read the words. It was short and simple. "I know what you did. You can't hide forever. The game's not over yet." Ember's breath caught in her throat. The message had all the signs of Ethan. The arrogance, the threat disguised as a statement, the clear assumption that he was still in control. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the possible implications. He was out there. He hadn't given up. And now, it seemed like he had a plan to take back what he lost. The old Ember might have been afraid. She might have spiraled into a panic, second-guessing every decision she'd made in the past months. But this was a different Ember. The Ember who had fought back when everything seemed lost. The one who had risen from the ashes of betrayal. She wouldn't let fear control her again. This time, she would take the initiative. She would find him first. Without wasting any time, Ember started researching. She traced the number back through various online databases and contacts, working with private investigators who had helped her through the initial phases of her financial recovery. Soon, she had a lead. Ethan hadn't vanished into thin air after all. He was living in a small town about an hour away, staying in a house that didn't appear to have much value. A place where no one would look twice. Ember had known he would try to hide, but what struck her as odd was that he had been so careful to stay off the radar. For someone who had once believed he could manipulate his way through life, this was an unusual step. It almost seemed like he was trying to prepare for something, like he knew Ember would come for him. The next morning, Ember packed a bag. She wasn't sure what she'd find when she arrived, but she was prepared for whatever came next. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, the calm determination that had grown within her these past months acting as her shield. She wasn't walking into the unknown anymore. She was walking toward the end of a chapter that had dragged on far too long. When she arrived in the small town, Ember's instincts kicked into high gear. She parked her car a few blocks away from Ethan's new home and approached on foot, careful not to draw attention to herself. The house was unremarkable, sitting quietly in a neighborhood of modest homes. It looked like the kind of place people moved to when they were trying to disappear, but Ember could feel the tension in the air. This was where the game would end. She waited until nightfall, watching from a distance as lights flickered on and off inside. Ethan had to be there. He was hiding something, and Ember was determined to find out what it was. She took a deep breath, then made her move, crossing the street quietly. She wasn't here to confront him, not yet. She just needed to know what he was up to. As she got closer, Ember noticed something strange. The blinds in the front windows were drawn, but there was a flicker of movement, shadows shifting behind them, as though someone was watching the street. For a moment, Ember wondered if Ethan knew she was there. Had he seen her arrive? Had he been waiting for this moment, preparing for it? Her pulse quickened, but Ember steadied herself. She was in control now. She knocked on the door, not with hesitation, but with purpose. When the door opened, Ember was ready, but what she didn't expect was what happened next. Standing there was not Ethan, but a man she didn't recognize, tall, unshaven, with a hard, cynical look in his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone more curious than welcoming. Ember didn't flinch. "I'm looking for Ethan. I'm an old friend," she said, keeping her voice calm and steady. "I need to talk to him." The man's expression shifted slightly, just enough for Ember to catch the flash of something behind his eyes, a knowing, almost reluctant understanding. "He's not here right now," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "But if you're really looking for him, you should know that he doesn't live here anymore, and you've got a better chance of finding him if you stop looking for a fight." Ember's heart skipped. He didn't live there anymore. Ethan was on the move again, but why hadn't he contacted her directly? Was this his way of playing games? Of leading her in circles? Ember's mind raced. This was more than just a simple escape. Ethan was trying to make her think he was gone for good, but he wasn't. He was playing a deeper game, and Ember was determined to follow it to the end. She nodded and backed away slowly, not showing any sign of the growing frustration inside her. "I'll be seeing him soon then," she said, her voice colder now. "Just make sure he knows that." As Ember turned and walked away, she felt the familiar rush of determination wash over her. She knew Ethan would make a mistake. He always did. And when he did, she would be there, ready to finish what had started. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days passed in a haze of impatience for Ember. Every step she took, every new lead she followed, brought her closer to the truth, but also further into the web of lies Ethan had spun around himself. There were moments when she felt like she was chasing a ghost. Ethan's presence, his touch on the world, seemed to slip through her fingers every time she thought she had him cornered. His new life was like a moving target. Yet the harder Ember pushed, the more determined she became. There was something about the way he had underestimated her, about the way he had taken everything from her with such ease that kept the fire burning inside her. She wouldn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not until she had everything back, everything he had stolen, both from her and from the life they once shared. Then came the call. The call Ember had been waiting for. It wasn't from Ethan, but it was just as important. The private investigator she had hired months ago had dug up something crucial. They had found a bank account, one that wasn't listed under any of the aliases Ethan had used. This account held large sums of money, and it was only a matter of time before they traced its origin. Ember's pulse raced as she read the message from the investigator. Ethan had been laundering money, using his old business dealings to stash away stolen funds. He wasn't just running from her. He was running from something much bigger, something he couldn't hide from forever. With this new information, Ember felt the weight of the situation shift. She no longer needed to hunt him down for revenge or closure. This wasn't about payback anymore. This was about justice. It was about exposing Ethan for the fraud he was. She wasn't going to just take back what he had stolen from her. She was going to take him down. Ember's thoughts were clear now, her plan set into motion. The stakes had changed. This was bigger than a personal vendetta. This was a matter of righting wrongs, of proving that no one could just take what they wanted and walk away without consequences. The next move was to involve the authorities. Ember didn't hesitate. She provided the investigators with everything she had: documents, records, and the key pieces of evidence that would bring Ethan's entire scheme crashing down. She could already imagine the look on his face when the police showed up, when his world was torn apart in front of him. For once, Ember would not be the one left broken by his actions. He would have to face the consequences of his greed and manipulation. As the investigation gained momentum, Ember found herself feeling a sense of peace she hadn't anticipated. She no longer had to chase Ethan from one dead end to the next. The system would do the work for her now. And though the emotional scars from his betrayal would take longer to heal, Ember knew this. She had fought for herself. She had not allowed herself to become a victim, not once. She had turned the tables on Ethan, and in doing so, had reclaimed not just her money, but her dignity, her power, and her life. It wasn't long before the police tracked Ethan down. He hadn't been as careful as he thought. The fake names, the hidden accounts, none of it was enough to keep him safe. When the authorities arrested him, Ember was there to see it happen. She wasn't there out of anger or spite, but because she had earned the right to witness this. Ethan was finally getting what he deserved. For the first time in a long time, Ember didn't feel any bitterness. There was no joy in his downfall, no satisfaction in his arrest. It was just right. It was what should have happened from the very beginning. Months later, when the trial was over and Ethan had been convicted of fraud and theft, Ember sat quietly in her apartment, looking out at the city skyline. She had moved on. She had rebuilt her life. The legal battle was over, the house had been sold, and the money had been returned. More importantly, Ember had found something that was beyond any material possession: her strength. She had faced her darkest days and had come out on the other side. The journey wasn't over, but she had learned that sometimes the most powerful victory wasn't in taking something back from someone else. It was in finding the courage to walk away from the things that had hurt her and build something better. The phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her lawyer. Ethan's assets are being liquidated, and everything will be fully settled soon. Ember smiled softly. It wasn't just about the money. It was the final piece of closure, the last stitch in the tapestry of her recovery. She was free, completely free. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across her apartment, Ember realized that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. There would be new challenges ahead, new opportunities, but this time she would face them on her own terms. She had learned that life could be unpredictable, but the one thing that would always remain in her control was her ability to rise, no matter how far she had fallen. And so, with the echoes of the past fading into the distance, Ember stepped forward into the future, knowing she had won the battle that mattered most, the one for herself.